I think we are live right now. Hello. I'm sure the three of us are on the same page. We've got lots of thoughts and feels and excitement. I'm so excited to be here tonight with both of you, as well as our stellar lineup of panelists tonight. I'll give another formal hello. My name is Melissa Elmira Yingst. I am the host of Melmira. I'm also a proud Gallaudet graduate. I graduated in 2000 with a BA in psychology. I currently live in Southern California.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with the two of you tonight. As we look forward with some nervousness and anticipation, it's not on Facebook, a first for me. I'm Jeff Lewis, a Gallaudet alum, class of 1976, which seems many and many a year ago. I have taught there for many years in the Department of Counseling, and I'm now serving as interim provost. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Over to you.
Hello, hello, hello. It is so inspiring to be here. I've got chills. It's just such an important night, and it's exciting, and we are obviously looking forward with anticipation. I am Khadijat Rashid. I'm the interim dean of the faculty here at Gallaudet University. I also graduated from Gallaudet back in 1990, majoring in business. Sort of went on my way a little bit, came back teaching in the Department of Business, and have been here ever since, and just couldn't be more delighted to be here with this outstanding crew of folks.
Likewise. So welcome everyone who's watching tonight. I'd like to formally welcome you to Gallaudet Center for Democracy in Deaf America's election night event entitled Waiting and Watching, Understanding Election Night Through an Interdisciplinary Lens. In short, that means the three of us will have about a 10-minute conversation with each panelist. Those conversations are going to center around a big question about the election based on their expertise and lived experiences regarding tonight's election.
We want all of you to know that any one of you can pose a question, a follow-up question. Please feel free to type in the comments on the Facebook page. We have people hard at work with us, diligently monitoring that feed, who will be sending those questions to us for discussion.
Now, you know that Gallaudet offers a variety of majors, and so we have brought in a group of experts in their various fields to share with us from their expertise, from their lived experience, and from their research. So we also have people representing all sorts of minority groups, such as Latino, Latina, Latinx people, the immigrant experience, African American, Arab American, women, the GLBTQIA community.
Definitely. We represent a variety of expertise and disciplines, such as linguistics, history, philosophy and ethics, interpretation, psychology, and statistics, to name a few. So the panelists tonight really do bring a lot to the table.
And today, throughout the day, in all of our meetings, we've seen everybody is very thoughtful about the elections taking place here in America, in fact, thoughtful across the world about these events. And we're delighted to have this event because we want to better understand the political world. Tonight is intended to allow us to understand it from an interdisciplinary lens. As many of you mentioned, we have gathered together from various disciplines, psychology, so forth, all bringing these various backgrounds and identities of Black, Latinx, and so forth.
And as an additional benefit, we hope that tonight's events will highlight the value of a liberal arts education at Gallaudet, where we bring in diverse perspectives. to help us think critically, analyze effectively, and communicate and sign persuasively.
Definitely. Please know that initial reports of results in swing states are not going to be available until about 8 p.m.-ish. According to the Washington Post, we'll probably get earlier results in some pretty heated battleground states such as Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, with voters who have widely embraced early voting and rules that allow officials to verify mail ballots before Election Day. But on the other hand, we also know that it could be a while before we know the results of other key states such as Pennsylvania and Michigan. So we may not know those results for quite some time. So this certainly is a waiting game. I'm sure that everybody feels this sense of watching and waiting, and we're all in this together.
Agreed, agreed. And in part because of the pandemic and the additional time required to vote, to count mail-in ballots, we may not know the full and final results until late into the evening or even in the next days. Some states did not begin counting at all until today. We will, however, be kept apprised of events as they transpire throughout our session tonight. And as we learn new information, we'll bring it into the conversation. As we see some states, each of the different people running are moving into leads back and forth, we'll keep you apprised of that. So now, we would like to welcome our first panelist, Miyako Villanueva, Linguistics Department. Would you please appear? Dr. Villanueva, thank you.
Welcome, Miyako.
So excited to be here.
Miyako and I have known each other for quite some time. It's always a pleasure to see her. So Dr. Miyako Villanueva is a linguistics professor at Gallaudet. And the question that I have for you specifically is, when it comes to politics, people often say to each other, why doesn't the other side listen to common sense? How does your academic background in linguistics generally, and framing specifically, explain why liberals and conservatives do not share a common sense? Many of us have these feelings that we're unable to get where someone else is coming from. What's going on behind that?
Great question. As was just said, I study linguistics, and in doing that, I do think about language and how it is used to express meaning. So while we analyze words, phrases, signs, the intention behind all of that investigation is to see how meaning happens, how we make meaning from someone else's message, how we interpret meaning from their messages. So when you talk about common sense on a very literal level, you're talking about a shared sense or a shared conceptualization of something that is in common among us. So we're often talking about the same issues, the same problems, the same political situations, yes, yet we're coming at it from very different frames. And that gives us a different sense of what it is that we're talking about. I could give you a number of examples, but often political debates really stem from which frame someone is coming at an issue from. And what you're trying to do is convince people to adhere to your frame or to talk about your base, or talk to your base, which is people who already have a similar sense, their shared understanding of the world, maybe a similar background, a similar upbringing. But when other people have different backgrounds, different experiences, their frame is naturally different. So the very same words can mean different things to different people or offer different interpretations depending on which frame you come from. So this is something that is pretty frequently discussed in cognitive linguistics because we're talking about mental processes of language and what's really going on in our heads. I'll give you an example. Think about people that move to the United States. or people who want to move to the United States from other countries for various reasons. Some could frame this topic as illegal and call a person who wants to move to the US an illegal. And this connotes a belief that there is people who belong here and there are people who don't belong here, that there are rules that are established and this is what they want for their country. Another frame might recognize that someone's home country might not be a safe place, and they frame the United States as a welcoming place that's here to offer protection to anybody in the world. So same topic, same phrase can activate completely different meanings and frames. Politicians have mastered the use of the words that will appeal to people with different frameworks so that they can really speak to people who have a certain perspective. And the more skilled party so far, admittedly, or stance has been conservatives than liberals, admittedly. They're able to drive home their messages in very short, direct ways that appeal to people. And liberals often pack in many messages in one utterance or one phrase, and they do so in a way that tries to convey the nuance, but what they end up doing is kind of muddying the waters, and then they make it harder for people to really, or for the issue to really appeal to people. So this is not just about words and how we talk about an issue, but there's also a frame for the whole role of government in our lives, the role of nation states, countries, the United States, the Constitution, how we frame the Constitution, what that means for us. All of those discussions really center on meaning and frames. So this conservative and liberal perspectives on them are very different. What you expect from government, for example. The conservative viewpoint often describes a strong or strict father figure. This is a metaphor. So not father to evoke any masculine sense, but this sort of prototypical strict father figure, that there should be one person at the helm who you can put your trust in. They will take care of us. They will save us. And that's the kind of person you want to vote for to lead the country. Typically on the liberal end, they focus more on having equal opportunity, wanting to make sure that our entire society has support, that we want to make sure that the government has a role of providing support for everyone so that everyone can be included, have equal opportunity, equal participation, and that it's not a single person in a position where they make decisions for everyone. Instead, they want a much more collaborative model of how to govern a country. So these are two very different frames. And if at a very basic level, I really want someone individually, if I really want a more authoritative figure, if I want to be able to rest assured that there's someone who's in charge, they're going to take care of things, I'll vote for that kind of candidate. If, on the other hand, I'm looking for someone who's a real advocate for the people, I want someone who's going to think about me, support me, and provide for me, then I'm not going to want this sort of single strict father figure position. I'm going to really want someone who understands how to take on different perspectives. So the notion of common sense isn't necessarily exactly how we often think of it. Right. In fact, from the debates, I think that Bren mentioned that a good number of people already had that mindset before they even tuned into the debates. So the debates don't actually end up changing anyone's minds because they enter into that viewing experience already firmly rooted in their perspectives. But now that leads me to a follow-up question. Do you see any differences between how deaf conservatives and liberals use ASL in their conversational style or communication about these topics? Has it been studied before? Just wondering what your thoughts or perspectives are on it. Sure. I'm not honestly familiar with any particular research or results on this, but I think that the same frames happen whether you're using English or ASL, because the frames that I just described are more global. They're not language specific and they're not specific to a given word or phrase in a given language. It's more about how you look at something. So a deaf conservative, if they're looking for a strict figure, authoritative person, then that's who they'll vote for, whether you're deaf or an ASL user or not. So you might, if you want this strict authoritative figure, you might want someone that makes strong statements about the economy. Or if you are more invested in social issues and anti-racism work, you are going to listen for those kinds of messages and talk more often about those things. So I don't think it's really particular to how I sign or what a person signs. It's more about what sort of metaphors and what kinds of messages you use to describe the overall topic.
This is a fascinating conversation that somebody might be looking for an authoritative father figure, so to speak. I wonder, something that Melissa said has sparked me. Is it possible for someone to have a sense that they already know who they're going to vote for, and why would they have a debate anyway? If you know, if you at your core have a certain desire, what's the point of these debates?
Well, the linguistic analysis behind it, yes, it's theoretically possible, but you would need a person to have that expertise in sort of speaking the language of the other side so that they could use the terminology of someone coming from a different frame. So you would, for example, be a liberal who understands the kinds of terms that appeal to a conservative base. Could I represent my values through the kind of rhetoric that typically appeals to a conservative base that uses their message and framing that would say, that might lead you to say things like, I'll take care of you. I'll make sure everyone has clean water. You can trust me. So you would use different terminology. And what we typically do is see people using their frames to continue to deepen that divide that we already see in the US. But I think candidates who can appeal to the other side are able to do so because they're adept at the messaging and really speaking in a way that appeals to people who may have a different frame.
Last question for you. Last night at the Faculty Senate at Gallaudet, there was a very intensive discussion about how exhaustive this whole election process has been for so many, especially students from different marginalized communities. So a question that has been posed for us is there the potential for more impact on students of color such that Gallaudet will consider suspension of classes and work assignments for students who attend Gallaudet?
Definitely, this is an issue that is impacting different people differently. And it varies depending on your self-identity, which groups you affiliate with. So I've been talking about framing in a very sort of abstract academic way, but the reality is this directly affects real people's lives. We have already seen this with Supreme Court decisions and a number of things that are already shifting our society, and that will certainly have a very direct impact on people and each person based on their own lived experience, their own history, their own upbringing. That will all influence the kind of frame that they have. So any message, any meeting or homework assignment, anything is going to have an impact on people in a different way, depending on what frame they have, what they bring to their way of being. So yes, the impact is certainly not equal. Would it be possible to do something like hold off on assignments until after the election, or would that be something that professors would decide case by case?
Now, Melissa, you should have been there at our faculty senate last night for that discussion. I can tell you that there was a great recognition of the kinds of impact this has and how we have to consider that and how important it is to be sensitive and supportive given that. Gallaudet, I believe most, if not all, faculty will give students the space they need to process what they're feeling about this election.
That's so true. I'm actually teaching a couple of courses at CSUN, and we have just been talking this week about everyone taking time for themselves. So a lot of us decided to postpone our due dates until next week, just to give students any time they might need this week. And I'm glad to know that Gallaudet is on the same page.
And the opportunity to support each other. Miyako, thank you so much.
Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting me to be a part of tonight's discussion. I enjoyed it.
Dr. Miyako Villanueva from the Department of Linguistics. Thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. Roberto Sanchez, who is a professor in the history department. Hi, Roberto.
Hello, hello.
Okay, so I am dying to know the answer to this question. So Latinos are currently the largest minority in the United States, making up approximately 18% of the national population. The next largest minority group are African Americans with 13.5%. Who are Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx people in the United States voting for? What have been their voting trends in the recent presidential elections? And how do you think they're going to vote on November 3rd?
Well, thank you, and thank everyone here. I want to start off by giving just a little context in my personal background in terms of how that impacts my perspective as a person from Latin America who has grown up in California in an agricultural community. And it has an impact on the way I think and will respond to the question. So in response to this, I want to focus on two different aspects of this. Who are Latinos? How do we identify this group as an ethnic group? And the second point to that is how they have voted in the past and how they might be expected to vote tonight. Now, to respond to the first question, the very short and simple answer would be, it's a simple question with a very long answer.
Of course it is.
But I'll keep it as brief as I can. There are different names and labels applied to Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx, Hispanics, and so forth, other kinds of identities and backgrounds, Mexican, Mexican-American, Puerto Ricanos, Cubans, people from El Salvador, Dominican Republic, and on the whole, the second largest minority in the United States, with at 18%, followed by African Americans at 13.5%. And when we're looking at 333 million people, African Americans represent 13.5%. And so you see the sizable group of people we're talking about here. Of those, 32 million are eligible to vote for the first time in this election. So for the first time, we have expanded beyond the voting bloc of African Americans. So we're at that point in the progression of American history now. Now, who are Latinos? A bit about the history. Tells us that we are European, indigenous, African. We are a mixture of many peoples all across the Americas. There's North American indigenous people along with Spanish people, and then after the independence movements and the establishment of the Central and Latin American nations and different systems of government control, mostly in the South and Southwestern United States, we see large groups, and then we see another large group in Latinos in Florida in 1821 in the Florida secession, when they seceded from Spain. But we see larger concentration in the Western United States and in 10 central states, California, New Mexico, Nevada, parts of Colorado, parts of Utah, Wyoming, Kansas, Oklahoma. And the border moved, but the people did not. So now some points that speak to immigration. The largest group of Latinos are from Mexico, around 61%, which means 36 million people comprise in that group. Now in Puerto Ricans, we have around 5.7 million. Cubans, 4 million, 9, correction in the interpretation. And so each of these peoples have different lived experiences. They've come from different governance systems, different Catholic institutions have influenced some of these peoples in different ways. The kinds of values and traditions that they have vary. Even if you've lived under a dictator and lived through a civil war, your experience is informed by that in a different way than another Latino might be. Immigrants bring to the United States all of the values and the kinds of identities that we have. And many are aligned with white and European and indigenous lived experiences too. And many have been here for many and many a generation. They've not newly arrived, they've been here forever. So now, to speak to the second part of that question about the vote, most Latinos have historically voted Democrat. But I think there's been a slow shift in those demographics. We might ask why that's been the case and what the issues are at play. Most would think that's immigration and the border. But in fact, it's the economy. In many ways, the same as many other American voting blocs, it's the economy, not so much the border issues. And the election in 2016, Trump received 28% of the Latino vote. Tonight, he's expected to meet that goal or surpass it. That says something.
Really?
Why at this moment? Why? Since he was a candidate and since he was a president, he has used derogatory remarks about people from Latino communities, called them drug dealers and rapists and violent thugs and such, and characterized immigrants this way. And his immigration policies have separated parents for children. You would think no one would vote for him. What reason with these kinds of border policies could they have for doing that? But it has to do with the kinds of values and traditions that Latinos have that are traditionally very conservative, family-oriented, and a strong sense of military service embedded in, and the notion of business opportunities and educational opportunities being available if you work hard. Also, institutions of Catholic churches and those values against women's rights of choice and so forth, against gay and lesbian marriage. And the Catholic Church, though, has been dwindling in numbers. It's been largely replaced with evangelical Protestantism, which is even more strictly conservative than Catholicism, interestingly so. And so there's been an increasing divide in the gender gap, too, between Latino men having a preference for strong male leadership. They like a person who never apologizes. So Trump, in some ways, is a very attractive person to somebody who is looking for that machismo.
This is very interesting. I mean, just like Miyako said.
We have just a minute left, and I wanted to mention that you actually answered some of the questions that had been running through my mind that I've been asking myself literally. For example, how is Trump, contrary to popular opinion, maintaining such support from the Latino community? But you just addressed that by talking about what kind of figure he is and how that appeals to certain values. But I guess regardless of what happens, I have to say that I'm so excited to see that more Latinos are voting than ever. I saw a number that in one state, there are 500,000 Latinos voting for the first time ever in that state. So I have seen a great deal of campaigning and also just encouragement of the Latino community to vote. So thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez, for your thoughts this evening.
And Roberto, we're going to have to move on to the next speaker, but I do want to thank you very much for coming to us today from the Department of History. Professor in our Department of History, thank you so much. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce another professor at Gallaudet, Dr. Teresa Blankmeyer Berg. Teresa is a professor of philosophy. And the question that we pose to you is very philosophical in nature. In this time of polarized views, people seem to have a preference for set ways of being and seeing, and a strong sense of ridicule for the other side. They're staking out their positions. And how can we engage in respectful, vibrant discussion? Is it okay not to engage in such debate because of such views? And we live in a democratic system. Does that give us any moral responsibilities?
Thank you all for inviting me to participate in tonight's panel. It is an exciting night. It's an exciting time for us. And I want to thank you, Jeff, for posing the question that you did. I think I may start with one and then sort of answer some of the follow-ons. First, let me explain a little bit about what philosophy is. It can be summarized in many ways. My personal approach to it is that it's a discussion of an argument. So we take that concept of an argument, and that's really important for philosophy. And it's not argument in the sense of debate, but it's in the sense of presenting your views and then hearing somebody else out on their views. Now, an argument has two parts and then a conclusion. People often want to start with the conclusion. You know, this is my perspective, this is what I believe. And it's really important for us to think about the rationale and the supports behind our conclusion. So as we're making our argument, as we're engaging in this dialogue, we don't stake a claim right up front. We really enter into an open dialogue and we ask people to unpack their argument. What is their rationale? What is their reason for what they think they believe, what they say they believe? And so we're asking for understanding rather than trying to plan our own comeback. I think it's also important to consider what's involved in that dialogue. You know this, we've seen it on the media, that there's the liberal and conservative view, and it's really about labeling, name calling, and putting people in boxes. You know, if somebody has a point that they're trying to make, and their argument maybe is not as strong as they want it to be, they can be distracted by some other sort of argument or some other sort of labeling technique. So there's something called logical fallacies in philosophy. So name calling, for example, is one of the fallacies. The fallacy of ad hominem attacks. Another one is known as the red herring. Herring is a type of a fish and it sort of distracts you from the main argument. So in philosophy, we are trained to recognize those kinds of fallacies that are getting us off track. And I think it's important to engage in an honest dialogue. It's not helpful when you're having a dialogue then to point out a fallacy. That I'm not encouraging that. But it is helpful to be able to recognize it and try to ask questions in a respectful way that gets beyond those sorts of techniques. So if you think this person has no point whatsoever and they're not even worth listening to, you can start from a point of curiosity and ask for clarification. Ask them to go deeper. Ask them to unpack who they are, where they're from, what's happened that has led them to this point of belief. That can be quite helpful. The next question that you asked about was whether it's ever justifiable to not engage with another person because of their ideas. And I think there are two different responses that I would offer to that question. So if you feel that you are exposing yourself to harm, that is not required. You may walk away and feel that that was the right decision to make. It's self-protection on some level, and that you do have to take care of yourself. Right after 9/11, the events of 9/11, my experience as an Arab American was that I became actually quite guarded in who I talked with. I just became more cautious, more careful. It's not a surprise for most of you. You would expect that kind of outcome. But it's important to recognize our responsibility and the harm of deciding that you don't want to engage with people because what we're expected to do in a democracy is in fact to engage and dialogue and have the liberal arts approach to it, that sort of way of thinking. I do have a question, follow-up question in terms of multiple perspectives and trying to understand and maybe asking clarifying questions. What about if that person is in your family? You know, the last few years we've heard about the wars that have happened at Thanksgiving dinner tables and people just refusing to speak to each other and just not able to get along. Any philosophical advice you can offer for how families might navigate these difficult times?
Such a good question.
Well, you know, Dr. Rashid, we've known each other for a long time, and you probably know what my response is going to be, but I grew up with a mother who was a Democrat and a father who was a Republican, and they were both entrenched in those positions. And we had dinner table discussions, and I was always fascinated with how they brought those discussions to table. They were, first of all, very respectful to each other. And the second thing I learned from them was how to engage in dialogue when you're talking to somebody who doesn't agree with you. I think sometimes in families, people get their feelings hurt very easily and they become emotional very quickly. And sometimes it might be helpful to figure out that in this moment, we need to take a pause. Let's just take a deep breath, everybody. It's becoming too heightened in terms of emotionality. And sometimes that helps. And of course, it's not always easy. You know, in philosophy, we are trained to engage in argument. And that can be fun for us, you know, but for many, many individuals, arguments can actually be very personally felt and quite upsetting. And sometimes people feel like if you are destroying an argument, you're really destroying a person's ego. So it's important to recognize that you're maybe attacking an argument and not the person. And maybe in some families, it's important to talk about other topics. In my family, you know, there are people who don't like to argue, but we all love the Dodgers baseball team. And so, you know, when they won the World Series, yep, absolutely. That was a happy moment for us that we could talk about.
Right. Go LA.
Well, and we're almost out of time, but I do want to say that your upbringing with one parent, a staunch Republican, one a staunch Democrat, was a great model to allow you to teach in this particular kind of discussion about civility.
Definitely.
Amazing.
You literally saw both sides. That's certainly amazing.
I think our presidential candidates, Biden and Trump, have both divided our country's views, and quite painfully so. And I have to share a little bit of news, just live updates from Florida. The race is neck and neck with Biden in the lead by a slim margin. 63% of votes are in. And they say that West Virginia has been called for Trump. Virginia has been called for Biden. Exciting news, fills us with anticipation. We'll see what happens. How are you feeling, Teresa, before you take off? How are you feeling this evening?
Well, I'm feeling good. I'm certainly curious about the outcome. I would like to see what the next steps are going to be. My hope is, of course, that the next president will appoint me to the Bioethics Commission, or would be somebody who's involved in those kinds of issues. They're important issues. I'd certainly like to see the field garner the attention it deserves.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burke. I'd also like to just put out a reminder to all of those watching on Facebook Live. You can go ahead and type in a question on Facebook. We do have someone behind the scenes relaying all of your questions to us. So if you have questions, bring them on.
Welcome, Richie, and Mr. Richie Bryan here with us tonight. So we've known each other many, many, many years, since our college days, in fact. But we've brought you here tonight to talk about a very specific question. There was a recent controversy about a Facebook page that featured ASL interpreters interpreting right-wing videos. Those videos were not captioned. Some people felt that this was disinformation, and in fact, unethical on the part of the interpreters who were interpreting those videos. Now, you come to us as a certified deaf interpreter, a CDI. Richie, do you agree that it was disinformation and unethical for interpreters to interpret those videos? Why or why not?
Well, I think it's first a little important to talk about some background to the whole scenario so that we understand the context for my answer. This first came out with interpreting political commentary that was on video but not captioned. There was first a group that did that, and it was a pro bono volunteer effort. People volunteered to interpret political debates, things of the sort, whatever side of the aisle it came from. And it started to lean liberal. And conservative people would submit videos, and occasionally they would get interpreted, but not all that often. Many interpreters didn't feel comfortable interpreting for such conservative videos. And so there was another group that was created called Right Side ASL. Right Side ASL heavily leaned conservative, pulled conservative videos in and interpreted a great many of them on the right side in opposition to the other group. So just a little context to how they got started. So the controversy recently exploded because many of the videos that they were interpreting were misleading, had erroneous information, false news, and were fooling deaf consumers into believing misinformation. So people are saying that those interpreters who interpreted for the misinformation were in violation of ethical protocols, and saying that they should be censored for it. My response to the question, though, is that they should not. They should not be censured for that. The reason being, the Constitution protects free speech in the First Amendment. The very First Amendment protects our speech. So that, right or wrong, whatever you think, you have the right to say it. That is pivotal. And so that applies to anyone, including deaf people, deaf or hearing people. And so, yes, some of that information is false, but nonetheless, it is the deaf consumer's autonomous decision to decide whether to believe that information or not. It should not be censored by a refusal to interpret it. So, Right Side ASL had two tenets to their page. I mean, they were looking to two tenets in the RID code of professional conduct. And in terms of that notion, they knew people wanted access to Republican-leaning material and wanted access to it, and they were going to provide it. The second tenet was that they wanted to maintain ethical practices in doing so. So they didn't want to control communication access. So whether the interpreter liked it or not, what's pivotal is communication access. regardless of an interpreter's views.
I actually just had this conversation with a couple of interpreter friends of mine, and one main reason that they objected to the interpreting of this videos is that some of the interpreters aren't really indicating the tone of what people in the videos are saying. For example, there was one video where a nurse was giving some false information, but apparently when you listen, there's a sense of her sounding uncertain or not sure, but the tone of the interpretation looks very certain and very assertive and authoritative. So I understand the point about access, but I would hope that the tenets about being ethical also carries over into how you interpret one's tone.
And indeed, now if a consumer should report to RID if an interpreter is not being ethical, they have a reporting process for that. We must ensure that, I don't know whether that's misguided information, whatever the case, they still have a right to do it.
I have a follow-up question. You recently started a vlog series entitled My Blackish Brain, that's on Facebook, that focuses on elevating the discourse in anti-racial work, social justice, and ASL and deaf studies. So I'm wondering, in terms of elevating the discourse in those various fields, how has the content that you've just discussed and analyzed shaped your perspective on tonight's election?
Well, I set up a fake Facebook page called My Blackish Brain, which kind of acted as my outlet, my therapy, if you will. It became my way of processing my experience, especially with the advent of BLM, and there were several white people who came to me for these discussions. And instead of dealing with these individually, I wanted to share my thoughts en masse, put it out there in a public space for people to be able to view and access it. And so that was my reasoning for establishing the page in the first place. Now, to deal with anti-racism is very difficult. But I would like to look at how it is to describe to white people what it is to be Black. Society, for a period of over 400 years, since having enslaved Africans and brought them over on the boat, has established systems that are still in play, still to this day in play, that are tied to what an author I'd like to reference, Dr. Nolan Cabrera, posed in an article entitled White Immunity.
I've not heard of that one.
And he speaks to the notion that everyone talks about white privilege, but he feels it's a misnomer because poor people living in Appalachia, for example, feel it very difficult to understand how they might be privileged because they're not wealthy, they have no political connection, and how could they possibly be considered privileged? And so Dr. Cabrera says, instead, we should be talking about white immunity, and it makes a great deal of sense. White people are often given this cloak such that things don't stick, if you will. Something that could be detrimental won't stick in quite the same way as it would to a Black person engaging in the world, trying to navigate higher positions, for example. The moment you are a Black person who makes the slightest error, you're on the tightest leash and overcorrected for it in ways that white people aren't. This happens in employment, but we have to look not just in one sector. We have to see racism as tied to the entirety of systems. Tar Gillen has talked about whiteness as a whole being a thing that one eats, sleeps, and breathes. It is so pervasive in such that the rules everywhere are based on it, so that Black people represent a change and a force against that. And we have to work against that view to be able to see and extricate ourselves from the system to be able to see it instead of just copying it.
Wow, thank you, Richie. Thank you so much. This is a very deep, profound thoughts. I'm still processing it, but you've given us a lot to chew on for sure. I know that our time is short and we're going to be calling our next panelist. So I'll just thank you, Richie, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Richie.
Thank you.
I am looking forward to our next panelist, Dr. William Ennis, also a professor in the history department.
Hello, hello.
Hi there. So glad you could join us this evening. So, this is a question that makes me think a lot about what I've seen Trump saying in the media and what the media is saying about Trump and his views espousing a racehorse theory, which is a theory of human development that superior men and women will have superior children. This brings to mind eugenics and the idea that eugenics is supposedly making a comeback in politics today. So could you tell us more about what eugenics is and tell us how your historical studies of eugenics in the deaf community can inform how we understand the role of eugenics in politics today?
Happily, although it is hard to follow Richie Bryant. Wow, that was very profound message that he shared, but thank you for having me. I am also delighted to be here. I don't get to talk about my research on eugenics all that often, so very happy to be here. The definition that I use in my classes with my students is that eugenics is the manipulation of the population through breeding. It's fairly simple, but of course, it's quite complicated. And the metaphor, obviously, that we use is Nazi Germany, because eugenics actually has two different types. There's positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics, again, it's manipulating breeding for specific traits. So that if you want a specific trait, you manipulate the parent DNA to get that trait. So you can select for blonde hair. If you pick a blonde woman and a blonde man, and they may produce blonde children. And so, of course, that's where we get the Aryans that were so beloved by the Nazi belief system. And those people were granted honors, whether financial or other kinds of honors, because they fit the idealized version. The opposite, of course, is negative eugenics. Again, we see examples in Nazi Germany. The first target for negative eugenics was actually not the Jewish people. In Germany, it was people with disabilities who were first targeted to be selected out of the population. And the idea was get rid of the genes that result in disabilities, and we will get rid of all people with disabilities. So that's the definition that I use in class with my students. And when we talk about positive and negative eugenics, there is, of course, a spectrum. It can be overt, it can be covert, it can be harsh, like we saw in Nazi Germany. It can be more mild, it can be explicit, or it can be vague. With the recent election cycle and the conversations that have taken place in the public sphere, we see that the racehorse theory is sort of reappearing fairly explicitly. I really compare that to a book that was written in 1990. The author's name is Troy Duster. Wrote a book on eugenics, actually important in our field, scholarly book, but it's called Backdoor to Eugenics. So it's sort of, getting to something that maybe most people consider abhorrent, but in a very mild, subtle, nuanced way that then captures the imagination of the population. So rules and laws can get passed in a more palatable way. So the racehorse theory is a little bit of a backdoor. So it's sort of common sense. Of course, if you want, you want a faster horse, you breed the fastest horses you have to produce a fast horse in the future. That sort of makes sense. But that is a backdoor to eugenics. If we apply those sort of breeding metaphors to humans, it gets very complicated. People get marginalized, and ultimately can be much worse than that. The first time Trump used that was in Minnesota. He was at a speech in Minnesota. And he said, apparently, he was complimenting the crowd who had come out to see him. And he said, "You have good genes. You have good genes." Now that takes me back just a bit. He's complimenting the crowd on something they have no control over. And he even mentioned racehorses. So when I saw that, people in general, when politicians start using that line of argument, talking about genetics, talking about genes, it is eugenics at base. And it's talking about human engineering. I know my friends and colleague were taken aback when we start seeing that kind of conversation happening, that kind of language used, Teresa being one of them, of course. And it puts us on edge because we realize it's a slippery slope to what happened in Nazi Germany. It can happen again. It could happen again. You learn from history, Nazi Germany, their racial laws, their racial planning, their ideology, all of it started actually in the USA. So I don't think many people know that, but many of the ideas that they ran with really had their beginnings in the USA, in sterilization laws that were put in place in the United States. So don't think that I'm criticizing Trump. My concern here is actually different. My concern is that eugenics has actually been promulgated by both conservative and liberals, Republicans and Democrats. Margaret Sanger, a woman who fought for women's rights, who fought for the right to abortion, was a eugenicist herself. So it's not something that you can sort of paint the brush that it's only those people who possibly have these beliefs. And in this election cycle, it seems to have resurfaced with some of Trump's comments, and it is concerning. That's how I'm looking at it. So a follow-up question. I remember some of my professors when I was a student talked about their escape from Nazi Germany or from Europe. And some of them were sterilized. And I remember just being shocked to hear that news. Do you believe that such a thing could happen again? It's ironic in a way that my research isn't looking at overt eugenics. I mean, I study eugenics against deaf people, but it's not really overt, generally speaking. There are situations that happen where deaf people have been sterilized in the United States because they were deaf. So we are aware of those kinds of cases. And that research is being led now. That isn't the focus of my research, because the research that I do is not overt. But the truth is, the more you learn about history, the more you have to be aware. So just the talk itself has an impact. Impacts who can get married to whom, who's encouraged to have children, who's not encouraged to have children. And that is the concerning point.
Thank you so much, Billy.
Sadly, our time is up, but thank you so much. This election brings up so much that we have to deeply consider. Thank you for being part of this wonderful conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
And it is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Caroline Pezzarosi. professor of psychology in our Department of Psychology at Gallaudet. Now, I have a question to pose to you that I find quite interesting. According to a Marquette poll done by Marquette Law, they found that 80% of Trump voters expect him to win, and only 11% of Trump voters expect Biden to win. And then polling said 80% of Biden voters expect him to win, and 11% expect him to lose. So, such stark parallels there. How would you study this false consensus effect happening in 2020? Or would you say in 2016, people didn't see this happening? People expected Clinton to win and were quite surprised.
Right. So this is a two-part question, isn't it? First, we need to define what the false consensus means and what it is. In a very basic sense, it's a cognitive bias that we all have. We look for things that reinforce our beliefs. We surround ourselves with like-minded people. We don't take the time to actively filter out information that is full of flaws. We don't like to be wrong. We're inundated with information with this 24-hour news cycle. So we don't always filter out information that doesn't make sense. And we end up getting false information. We're then surrounded by, and then we surround ourselves with people who are like-minded, and we overestimate a sense of shared values, shared beliefs, and opinions. Now, when our attitudes are already very strong and entrenched, it becomes extremely difficult, almost impossible to change an attitude. If you're sort of on the fence, then you are much more open to influence. But if you've dug your heels in, you only go deeper. This goes back to what Dr. Villanueva started off with when they talked about framing choices and word choices, that the same words appeal to a person who have a certain cognitive bias because of this false consensus bias. And again, we're constantly working to collect information about what we believe, but then we're also exhausted because we're inundated with all kinds of information or messages. We also have to consider here the availability heuristic, which is what we already have, what is already available to us is sort of the easier route. Are we going to then take the time to really analyze the news source that we rely on? Do we really question who it is that we're following, who we're reading, who we believe, who we're learning from, who we follow on social media, where we get our information from? So with the Clinton election, this is the other part of your question. Why was this so unexpected and surprising? I think that this has a two-part answer. One has to do with the diffusion of responsibility. Many people thought that she was a clear winner, and so then they did not take that sense of responsibility to vote. What also is at play there is, well, it's just one vote. She's going to win anyway. What does it matter? The other part of that has to do with voter suppression. People expected to experience voter suppression, so that led to a sense of apathy. And it goes back to what Richie Bryant said, where it's hard to be Black. As he said, the system is racist. And infused in it are a series of barriers, small and large, because the system was created by and for white people.
Agreed. And just a little bit of updates on the election, and then we'll come back to you. So far, some states have been called for Trump and some for Biden, as expected. So I see Delaware, Illinois, Maryland have been announced for Biden, Alabama, Tennessee, Missouri, and Michigan have been called for Trump.
No, not
but
Michigan.
None
not
of these are
Michigan.
surprises. Oh, sorry. Minnesota.
Mississippi.
Thank you for that.
That's Mississippi.
Oh, sorry, Michigan. What did I say?
Mississippi and Missouri are the ones that have been called.
Thank you. And Florida, where I am, they say is just neck and neck too close to call. So it's going to go to the wire. And there's a heavy eye on Pennsylvania and Ohio as potential swing states. And so of those that are left, we have Texas to look at, a few other really key states. And I know we're biting our fingernails until we'll be nailless tomorrow, perhaps toeless. Okay, so back to you, though, Dr. Pezzarosi.
Well, people are engaged. People are paying attention to the news. So then you have to question what news sources they're following and what they're understanding, who's doing the explaining and who's providing a counter argument. We are seeing record numbers of early voting. In Texas, the amount of early voting surpassed the total number of voters in 2016 alone. So people are truly watching and paying attention. Maybe we sort of learned our lesson from 2016. Maybe all of the people who didn't think that their vote meant much in 2016 are now making sure that they turn out to vote.
Well, and also, I think there's a very strong sense of entrenchment of opinion after the election. We know that one of these opinions is going to win the day. And if won, how then will those that didn't have their candidate win go forward? Similarly, for the other group, what do you think that's going to be like?
I go back to what Dr. Blankmeyer-Burke very eloquently said, where it really is a matter of we need to have more sophisticated discourse. We need to understand how to have the conversation. Someone needs to be able to take the microphone, and just taking the microphone doesn't help. We need to really have someone behind the microphone that can focus on the nation's health. And that means it's time to talk. It's really time to learn from each other. Certainly, I think a major reason why people are so anxious is because they know no matter who wins, there's going to be some degree of unrest from either side. And that inevitability is what's so nerve-wracking. So I think everyone feels like there's a need to roll their sleeves up, certainly, and really get down to work.
Exactly. Our country has gone through a pandemic, a racial reckoning, economic disparity, and an election that is about everything our country is about.
Right. There's been a lot packed into 2020.
This year has been heavy.
And 2020 isn't even over. People are looking forward to 2021. Hurry up, right? But it's still a month and some 3 quarters left to go.
To that, I'll add that I just saw this meme. You think everyone that happened in 2020 has an expiration date? No, 2021 is going to be more of the same. That really kind of hit me hard. It's like, okay, got to gear up for that.
I'll say, no, I am set that 2020 will wrap it. It'll come to a close.
The psychology of elections, too, also is influenced by the trauma of this year and all that we have faced with the pandemic, climate change, economic collapse, social change. It has been so hard on people. And that takes me back to the original audience question about whether Gallaudet is giving students a break or a time to pause. And I'd say to that, yes and no, because there needs to be some sense of normalcy and routine that we can at least count on so that we know what's expected of us. And that ability to have something that helps us take a first step and just go step by step, for example, go to a class, do an assignment, do a paper, is what can restore a sense of normalcy.
Thank you for that, Dr. Caroline Pezzarosi, Professor of Psychology. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next panelist to be welcomed is Todd Paneo, there you are, welcome.
Hello, hello.
So you are a teacher of math and statistics. The question we have for you is as follows. Most pollsters, predictors, political scientists, and observers, including Trump himself, according to the reports, misjudged Trump's chance of victory in 2016. What went wrong? Were the pollsters wrong?
Great question. Great question. Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, I find it very interesting to have seen the different stances and perspectives that previous panelists have brought. So now let's come to the numbers. Elections are at their core about numbers. There are, of course, many other factors that come into play. But what went wrong in 2016? I would say and argue that nothing went wrong. Pollsters made predictions as they do, based on probabilities of Clinton's win, based on probabilities of Trump's win. And they're looking at averaging different kinds of probabilities, and they came up with an 80% for Clinton and 20% for Trump, for example, in 2016. Well, very often people would interpret that to mean a guaranteed win. Sounds like a success. But let's take this and switch the example. Let's imagine we have a bowl of 100 M&Ms. And I tell you that 20 of those are poisoned, but 80 of them are great. So are you gonna eat any of those M&Ms? I think many of you would be pretty resistant if 20 of them could be fatally poisonous. But 20% sounds like a low percentage, right? But people still would feel differently about playing those odds. At 2016, the odds were called at 80-20, and that 20% still has a chance of happening.
It's fascinating how our mind works, that 20 equals 0 in a political election, but it's 100% in an M&M.
Right, but it's still a 1 in 5 chance in either case.
Right, right. So if you think about it, a lot of the discussion about who should interpret data, how to interpret data. So data exists and is out there, but how should we make use of it? Should we simply let the media take the data and interpret it as they will? But if we do so, those interpretations are often not done appropriately. They're doing so using a cherry picking effect, in effect to select selection bias, and that plays out in the words they use. For example, more likely to win, so-and-so likely to lose. But they don't bring forth those numbers, and so audiences are left to take those conclusions as a given, based on what they've said, without access to the actual data.
And they think it's
so what I would encourage is, right, media and journalists should be responsible and transparent and delivering that data so that the reader and audience can interpret it on their own. Those readers and viewers can be equipped to have the practice at interpreting that data. And that's another question. And I think many people are left thinking that the average reader or viewer doesn't have that sophistication to interpret the data. But that is an important question for us.
I have a follow-up question. We seem to see some of the same kinds of numbers, or even a more disparate number this time around than in 2016. We have got an 85% chance of a Biden win. Do you think that we're facing the same problem we faced in 2016?
Now, probability says that this would be the case, that Biden has a greater chance of winning than Clinton did. If we're looking at it, as we look at simulations, and interestingly, we see a 90-10 split there. But as I mentioned, if I give you that bowl of M&Ms and tell you only 10 of them are poisonous, how likely are you to feel like it is not a threat to you to eat it? So there's still a chance of the effect taking place. So it's very interesting. the in analysis of probability. The larger the scale of the number that we're talking about, the more certainty you can have about the sample. That's what we refer to as the N. The N of a group is the number of people that comprise the group. The smaller that N number that you begin your statistical modeling with, the less certainty you have. Now, with a greater population polled, we can be more sure of an accurate representation of the data. But US poll data isn't based on popular vote. Elections happen based on electoral college votes. And so we are often looking at the weeds instead of seeing things from a wider vantage. And so it's very much harder to predict those outcomes.
I actually have a perfect question from our audience that asked about that very thing. So from Facebook, we have someone who has asked, how can electoral college votes be counted without a 100% reported rate in a state?
So those that count those electoral counts that you're seeing are done by the news media. And they're doing so based on probabilities, based on the expected factors that they have and the given data sets that they have. And they're looking at a range of probability with a margin of error. And so if you get that margin of error and to the point where it's nearly nil, the news media outlet is likely to call that state for a given candidate to win, even though votes are still being tabulated at a certain point. But the margin of error becomes so small, it's marginal and can be counted and awarded to that state.
I'm trying to figure out the math as you'd explained it to us. So if it's, let's say they've counted 60% of the votes, but 40% of the votes are still coming in or haven't been tabulated yet. And let's say that 40 of that 60% voted for one candidate, 20% did not. Can they at that point announce for a candidate, knowing that 40% out of the 60 that came in, even though there's 40% of the population left? Did I misunderstand what you said?
So it could happen, but it depends on what that 40% looks like. So what counties are we talking about? And what are the known factors of that county? What has been the historical voting pattern in that county? All of that can give those news outlets a better picture of whether it's got the possibility of swinging over, flipping, or is leaning heavily towards one. And given the existing data that's come in from that county, we can understand how small that margin of error has gotten to at that point before it can be awarded then. Even though every vote hasn't been tabulated, it's sufficient enough to make that assumption. You know, I have to say, I come from New York City originally, and if I'm right, some 4 years ago, the early count in New York said Clinton by a mile. But once they started doing the full count for the whole state, then Clinton fell behind. So it started off with the early vote there. Those numbers were misleading in the end, if you will. So, Todd, I think you have given us a great bit of data visualization here. A great deal for us. Thank you very much. We're going to have you back another day.
Thanks so
Thank
much
you
for
so
being
much.
here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I am so delighted to introduce to you our university president, Bobby Cordano, to share some of her closing remarks and reflections. We're ready for you, Bobby.
Rabban, welcome. Holding us in suspense for your arrival. Great. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello and welcome.
Oh, it is wonderful to be here with you all. I think no other place would I rather be tonight than right here with all of you. I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversations and the discussions that have taken place this evening. You know, I have to say this is a model of what we see every day at Gallaudet. These kinds of conversations happen when we come together in our community, and it's just so inspiring to be a part of it, to learn and just observe. First off, though, I want to thank our just remarkable group of leaders from Gallaudet who've shown up this evening to share their various perspectives and experiences. I feel as though this is the best of a liberal education that we're seeing here on display this evening related to the elections, and most often think those are more in the realm of, government majors and political science majors, but that is not at all what this is about. We've seen evidence tonight that every discipline can offer a perspective, and each of those are available here at Gallaudet. Students can take classes from any one of the professors that they observed here this evening. And all the conversations about elections that we've seen tonight are really new, and it's great to see this. We owe our deepest sense of gratitude to our new Center for Democracy in Deaf America, and thank them for their work, especially Dr. Brendan Stern for his vision around this event, around the center, and all that comes with it. So congratulations to him. This really, for me, demonstrates what Gallaudet is able to do. We're beyond just preparing our students and our learners who come to us at all ages across the lifespan. We're more than just about preparing them for jobs and careers. This evening's discussion really displays that our deaf community, our signing community, shares knowledge with one another, shares experiences and various perspectives. And in doing so, these are deeply held perspectives and beliefs that come from our life experiences, our lived experiences, all of which were a part of this evening's discussions, helping us to see various perspectives and grow as individuals and as our community. To be able to see this done in sign language is equally thrilling. You this evening really displayed that notion of deaf gain here at Gallaudet. It's just beautiful to see what you're able to share with the world, present to the world, and as a result, our community becomes stronger, wiser, and really deepens our ability to analyze what we're seeing in the world around us, allowing us to be more engaged citizens of our world, within our own signing ecosystem and also within the world around us. We have the ability to participate as equal citizens in both, which is vitally important. I couldn't be more proud to be here with you this evening. I'm just amazed at actually the sense of emotion I'm feeling as I've been able to sit in and watch this. This is what we do every day. This is what happens within our classes, and it's just amazing to see it on display. I'm already looking forward to the elections 4 years from now, and once again we can bring people back. I know people will be looking forward to seeing the stars we saw this evening again 4 years from now. So thank you so much. Thank you, Malmira, for hosting this event this evening. Just the spirit and the comments that were shared were so uplifting. Provost Jeff Lewis, our Dean of Faculty, Khadijat Rashid, I want to thank you all for your wonderful leadership and the support that you provided. To our faculty, to our students, to our staff, and to our administrators, wonderful to see you bring this event together this evening and really show and showcase our best and brightest. So thank you to our leaders for all that you do. And thanks to everyone in our community for watching, for joining in this evening. Gallaudet is here with you. We are here to support our community in so many different ways. And tonight is just one more example of how we do that. I really want to encourage people to see other new developments that are happening in other areas of our university. Just a couple of weeks ago, we have a new Center for Black Deaf Studies that was launched. Lots of exciting events happening within that center. I'm very excited to see what our faculty, staff, and students will continue to bring from our community. So keep an eye out on that. Exciting times ahead for Gallaudet. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you. Thank you, President Cordano. And thank you to everyone joining us and watching tonight. As you're watching tonight, all of the exciting events on the news, please be sure you're looking to reliable channels. And be aware that candidates' platforms of social media and anchors on both sides may be making premature declarations. So be mindful and wait. Kubi.
You know, we have a complex system of elections across 50 states. And they have different authorities for how elections are run in local and state and federal level. So each of the administrators who are managing those elections are convinced that the system will be fair, just, and accurate. They are confident in those results. So let's be positive in our also confidence of those results.
With that, we all have to be patient. Let's process through the process. And regardless of what happens, let's be there for each other. This is truly an historic election, and we need to be mindful of the need for support now and in the months and years to come. I've really enjoyed my time with both of you this evening.
Thank
As
you.
did I. Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night.